The night my husband introduced me to his colleagues as the babysitter, I was wearing a dress that cost more than his monthly salary and standing in a building that processed payroll for every single person in that room, including him. I did not correct him. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I explain it, because I know how it sounds. I know the question you are already asking, which is why did she just stand there, why did she not say something, why did a woman who owns the room stay quiet while her husband made her invisible inside it? I have asked myself the same question. The answer is not simple and it is not flattering to me in every direction, but it is true, and truth is the only currency I have left that I am unwilling to spend carelessly. My name is Natalie Voss. For 7 years I was also Natalie Carver, which is what I put on joint tax filings and Christmas cards and the emergency contact form at my dentist's office. I answered to it without thinking. That is the thing about a name you take on willingly. It fits in a way that borrowed things sometimes do, comfortably at first, and then one day you catch your reflection and realize you stopped looking like yourself some time ago and cannot pinpoint exactly when it happened. I want to tell you this story from the beginning because the end only makes sense if you understand the architecture of what came before it. You cannot understand a building by looking at the rubble. You have to go back to the blueprints, back to the moment someone decided what the structure was going to hold and what it was going to leave out. So let me take you back. I grew up in a small house in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of house where the windows rattled in winter and the furnace made a sound every November like it was personally offended by the cold. My mother worked as a school administrator. My father drove long-haul routes and was home roughly 10 days a month, which as a child I thought was normal and as an adult I understand was its own complicated negotiation between two people who loved each other and also needed different amounts of space. They were good parents. They were honest people. They taught me the things that stick, not the decorative lessons but the structural ones, the kind that hold weight when everything else is shifting. My grandmother lived 4 houses down on the same street. Eleanor Voss. She was a hotel housekeeper for 41 years at the same property downtown, the kind of institutional loyalty that people from her generation wore without irony. She took the same bus every morning at 5:40 and came home at 3:30, and on her days off she sat in her front yard with a glass of sweet tea and a library book and did not appear to need anything that was not already in front of her. I spent more time in her house than my own from ages 6 to 14. She is the reason I am in the hospitality industry. She is the reason I understand what it means to care for a space, to make it function with dignity, to treat the invisible infrastructure of a place as the most important thing in the room. She told me once, I was maybe 11 at the time, sitting on her porch with a glass of that sweet tea while she hemmed a skirt by hand, that the people who run the world are almost never the ones standing at the front of it. She said it without drama, the way she said most things, as an observation, not a lesson. She said that the front of anything, a hotel lobby, a company, a family, is mostly decoration. The people who actually keep it standing are somewhere else entirely, doing the quiet work that nobody photographs. I did not know then that I was going to build a career around that idea. I did not know that the housekeeper's granddaughter from Columbus was going to co-found a consulting firm that reshaped the back-of-house operations of some of the most recognized hospitality brands in the country. I just drank my sweet tea and watched her hem the skirt and thought my grandmother was the most competent person I had ever met. She died my junior year of college. I was 20 years old and she was 73, and it was a stroke, which is a word that sounds too small for what it takes. I flew home from Ann Arbor in November and stood at the graveside in a coat that was not warm enough for the weather and felt the specific cold of losing someone who understood you without requiring you to explain yourself. It took me years to find other people who could do that. I am still a little careful about the ones I let try. I met Diane my freshman year at Michigan. She was my roommate for the first semester and my best friend by the end of it, which is the kind of thing that sounds like a convenient story but is actually just what happens when two people who think in the same language end up sharing 40 square feet of living space. Diane was from San Francisco, the daughter of 2 engineers, precise and funny and constitutionally incapable of tolerating inefficiency. She had a whiteboard above her desk before the end of the first week and a color-coded calendar by the end of the second, and I thought she was possibly the most organized human being I had ever encountered. What she thought of me took longer to understand. She told me years later that what she noticed first was that I asked questions nobody else in the room was asking. Not the aggressive kind of questions designed to prove something. The structural kind. The kind that go underneath the surface of whatever is being presented and look at what is holding it up. She said I did it without seeming to notice I was doing it, which was accurate. I did not think of it as a skill. It was just how I listened. We started talking about a business idea in our junior year. It was not dramatic. It was the way most real things start, as a conversation that keeps happening, keeps returning, keeps getting more specific until one day you realize it has become a plan. We had both done internships in hospitality operations and had both come back with the same frustration, which was that the consulting work being done for hotels and resorts was largely cosmetic. It was branding and aesthetics and lobby redesigns. Nobody was going inside the operations themselves, the staffing models, the guest experience frameworks, the back-of-house systems that either made a property exceptional or quietly eroded it from the inside. Nobody was asking my grandmother's question. We graduated in May and spent that summer in Diane's parents' kitchen in San Francisco building the structural framework for what would become Boschen Consulting. We had a laptop, a whiteboard borrowed from her father's home office, and a shared conviction that was more specific than passion. It was the quiet certainty of people who have identified a gap and know exactly how to fill it. We flew to Chicago in September because the hospitality market was dense there and we had 2 introductory meetings lined up through a contact of Diane's father. We rented a studio apartment in Wicker Park that was barely large enough for both of our suitcases. By the end of our first year we had 3 clients. By the end of our second year we had 11. By the end of our 4th year we had closed our second round of funding, hired a team of 8, and were being approached by brands we had studied in textbooks. I tell you all of this not to impress you but because I need you to understand what I was when I walked into the rooftop fundraiser in Chicago on a Thursday evening in October 11 years ago and met Marcus Carver for the first time. I was 25 years old. I had already built something real. I had already sat across from rooms full of people who did not expect much from me and changed their minds inside of an hour. I was not a woman who did not know her own value. I was a woman who chose, for reasons I am still examining honestly, to set it down for someone who made her feel chosen. Marcus was 30. He was in accounts management at a mid-size corporate events firm. He was tall and broad-shouldered and had that particular ease in a room that reads as confidence from a distance and takes longer to understand up close. He laughed quickly and listened with his whole body, and when he found out I was in consulting he asked smart follow-up questions that made me feel like the work I was describing was interesting to him specifically, not just politely. We talked for 2 hours that evening without either of us moving to circulate. He got me a drink without asking what I wanted and brought back sparkling water, which was what I had been holding, which meant he had been paying attention. He made a joke about the catering that made me actually laugh. When we exchanged numbers at the end of the night he said he hoped I would actually use it, not in a pressuring way, in the way of someone who is already a little worried you will not. I used it. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. They were good years, genuinely. I am not here to revise the early part of the relationship into something it was not, because that would make it a simpler story and a less honest one. Marcus was attentive and funny and made me feel, in the way that is specific to early love, like the version of myself I liked best was the one that existed in his company. We traveled. We cooked badly together and ate it anyway. We had the kind of conversations at 2 in the morning that feel like the realest kind, the ones where you say things you have not articulated before. He proposed on a Tuesday in March, which was not a special day, which I actually loved, because it meant he had not waited for a significant occasion to make it one. We were in the kitchen of the apartment I shared with Diane, who was conveniently staying at her boyfriend's that night, and he had made pasta, which was the one thing he could cook reliably, and after dinner he produced a small box from his jacket pocket with the practiced casualness of someone who had been carrying it for at least a week waiting for the right moment that turned out to be a random Tuesday. I said yes without a pause. I want to examine that yes now in a way I could not then. I said yes because I loved him. I also said yes because being loved by someone steady and present felt, after years of building something demanding and consuming, like the rest of something. Like finally being allowed to put something down. I did not examine what I was putting down. I did not ask myself whether the thing I was resting from was actually exhaustion or whether it was, in some complicated way, myself. We married the following October. Small ceremony, 40 people, a venue in the West Loop that I helped redesign 2 years earlier through a client project, which made the whole evening feel like a good joke between me and the building. Diane was my maid of honor. My parents were there. Marcus's mother Sandra was there in the front row in a blue dress she had bought 3 weeks in advance and mentioned to me twice before the wedding. Sandra Carver was not a cruel woman. I want to be precise about that because the simplest version of this story would make her a villain, and she was not exactly that. She was a woman who had built her identity around her son in the way that some parents do, quietly and completely, so that his success was her achievement and his choices were her endorsements. She had liked me in the beginning with what I understood was genuine warmth. What I did not understand until much later was that the warmth was conditional in ways that were not yet visible, that it existed as long as I occupied a role she found legible and comfortable, which was the role of grateful addition to her family rather than a woman with a separate, larger life. In the first 2 years of our marriage I told Marcus everything about the company. I did not hide it. I brought work home in the way that people who love what they do always bring it home, not disruptively but presently, the way a smell comes with you. I talked about clients and strategy and the particular satisfaction of walking into a property that was struggling and leaving it with a structural plan that would still be working 5 years later. He listened. He nodded. He asked occasional questions. What I noticed gradually, so gradually that I spent a long time wondering if I was imagining it, was that he never brought any of it back. A person who retains what you tell them will refer to it later, will connect it to new things, will ask the follow-up question 3 weeks after the original conversation. Marcus did not do that with my work. He listened in the moment with what appeared to be engagement and then it seemed to go somewhere I could not locate. His questions never progressed. He never retained the names of our major clients. He could not have described the firm's core methodology if asked. I told myself he was busy. I told myself that not everyone is naturally curious about consulting operations and that expecting him to be was unfair. I told myself a number of things that were each individually reasonable and collectively amounted to an explanation for something I should have examined more directly. The first time I noticed him actively minimize the work was at a dinner party, about 18 months into our marriage, hosted by friends of ours in Lincoln Park. Someone around the table asked what I did. Before I could answer, Marcus said, "She does some consulting work, keeps her busy." And then he pivoted immediately to something else. I sat there for a moment and then answered the original question myself, more fully, and watched the person across the table lean forward with genuine interest, and I told myself that Marcus had just been trying to give me the floor and had expressed it clumsily. That is the thing about building explanations for someone you love. You get very good at the architecture of justification. You develop skills you did not know you were practicing. By year 3 he had begun introducing me as his wife, always just as his wife, with no other context, which is not inherently wrong but which was wrong in the specific context of the rooms we were in, rooms full of people who introduced themselves by what they built and what they did, rooms where a name without a function was a way of being catalogued as decorative. I noticed the pattern and filed it under "not a big deal," which was a folder I was filling at a rate I was not yet willing to look at directly. By year 4, when Marcus joined Halcyon Group as a senior accounts director, the pattern had calcified into something I had somehow accepted as the shape of things. He went to his work events. He came home and reported on them the way you report on a territory you have been exploring alone. I was not part of the map. I had stopped expecting to be. What I had not fully registered, and what I understand now was the thing that made all of it not just painful but structurally dishonest, was that I was not separate from Halcyon the way Marcus believed. Voschen had a consulting relationship with 2 of Halcyon's major clients. More significantly, Diane and I held a minority investment stake in a holding company that had been part of Halcyon's original funding round. The connection was not public. It was not something Marcus would have found through a casual search. But it was real, and it meant that the wall between my professional life and his was far more permeable than either of us had discussed, because we had never discussed it at all. He never asked. That is the part one returned to most often. In 4 years of working at the same company that existed, at least partially, within the professional ecosystem I had helped build, he never once sat down and asked me whether our worlds overlapped. He did not ask because he had already decided, somewhere quiet and private, that my world was smaller than his. That whatever I did over there in my consulting life was tidy and contained and unlikely to intersect with anything that actually mattered to him professionally. He had made me small in his mind and then organized his reality around the smaller version. The night of the Halcyon reception was the first Thursday in October. Marcus had been preparing for it for 3 weeks. He had a new suit. He had a talking point memo on his phone that I saw him reviewing twice on the morning of the event. He told me over breakfast that the new CEO who had come in that spring was someone he genuinely respected and wanted to make a real impression on. He said the word impression the way people say it when they mean something closer to approval. He asked me that morning whether I was still coming. I said yes. He nodded, finished his coffee, and said, "You can just mingle and enjoy the food. You don't have to worry about the business side." I looked at him across the kitchen counter. I said, "Okay." I got dressed at 6. The burgundy dress had been in my closet for 2 years, purchased for an industry event I had attended in New York, never worn since. I put it on because it made me feel correct, not dressed up, just correct, like the version of myself that matched my actual proportions rather than the one I had been squeezing into inside this marriage. I did my hair. I put on the earrings my grandmother left me, small gold circles, plain and precise. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment before going downstairs and I thought about the 11-year-old on the porch with the sweet tea, and I thought, she would recognize this woman, and that mattered to me more than I expected it to. We drove downtown together. Marcus talked the whole way about the people who would be there and what he hoped to accomplish. I listened and watched the city lights on the windshield. We valeted the car and walked into the Fairmont, and the ballroom was already 3/4 full, warm and loud in that particular way of corporate events where everyone is performing ease. Marcus scanned the room immediately. I recognized the gesture because it was the opposite of how he scanned a room when we were together socially. At our own events he looked for me. Here he looked through me, cataloging the room for the people who mattered to the evening's purpose. He found a cluster of colleagues near the far bar and steered us in that direction with his hand briefly at my back. There were 4 of them. I remember a man named Greg, heavyset and friendly, and a younger man whose name I never caught, and 2 women who turned toward us with the mild interest of people who have been at a party long enough to welcome a new conversation. Marcus said, "Hey everyone, this is Natalie, she looks after things at home for us." He did not pause. He did not hesitate. He moved directly from that sentence into asking Greg about a project they had apparently been discussing earlier in the week, and the conversation reorganized itself around that new center, and I stood at the edge of it like a piece of furniture that had been walked around. The younger man glanced at me and said, "Oh, so you're the babysitter," with a light laugh. Marcus laughed too. He said something like, "Basically," and kept talking to Greg. I stood there for exactly 30 seconds. I counted because I was using the counting to keep the ground steady under me. Then I smiled at the 2 women, excused myself with a quiet pleasantness that I am still a little proud of, and walked to the nearest bar and ordered sparkling water. I stood with that glass and I looked at the room. I looked at all these people who had built careers and identities and were here together in this specific room because of the work they did, and I thought about the fact that I had arrived in this room as nobody. As the woman who looks after things at home. As the babysitter. And I thought about my grandmother hemming the skirt on the porch and telling me that the people who actually keep things standing are somewhere else, doing the quiet work that nobody photographs. And then I thought, not this time. I was not going to make a scene. I was not going to walk back over to that group and correct the record. Not because I lacked the words, but because a correction in that moment would have been about him, about responding to what he had done, and I was finished being organized around his behavior. What I was going to do instead was make a decision, the decision I should have made the first time I watched him edit me out of a room, but that I was making now with full information and full clarity and not a single qualification. I was going to stop making myself smaller to fit inside a life that had been shrinking me for years. I sipped my sparkling water. I breathed slowly. And then, at 8:43, I saw Diane Chen walk through the door of the Fairmont Ballroom in a charcoal blazer with her hair pinned back and 2 members of our legal team 3 steps behind her. She was here as the new CEO of Halcyon Group's most significant consulting partner. She was here, technically, as someone adjacent to Marcus's professional world in a way he had never thought to consider, because he had never thought to ask. She crossed the ballroom with the unhurried certainty of someone who has been the most important person in a room enough times to stop needing to announce it. And when she was halfway across the floor, she looked up and found my face, the way she has always found my face in crowded rooms, like there is some calibration in her that is set permanently to my frequency. She stopped walking. I shook my head very slightly. She read it immediately. 14 years of partnership means a shake of the head carries a full paragraph. She understood that I was not ready, that I needed a minute, that I was deciding something and needed to decide it completely before anything else moved. She looked at Marcus across the room. She looked back at me. And her expression said, "I see exactly what is happening here, and I am going to follow your lead." I nodded. She turned back to the event coordinator who had materialized at her side, accepted a glass of something, and let herself be guided into the reception. I finished my sparkling water. I set the glass down on the bar with a small, deliberate sound. And somewhere inside me, in the place where my grandmother's voice still lives, something that had been set down for a very long time was finally, quietly, picked back up. The morning after the party, Marcus made eggs. I want you to understand what I mean when I say that detail has stayed with me, because it is not about the eggs. It is about what the eggs represented, which was the complete and untroubled continuation of a life he believed was still operating exactly as he had arranged it. He stood at the stove in his Saturday morning clothes, the gray Henley he had owned since before we were married, and he scrambled 4 eggs with the focused pleasantness of a man who had attended a successful event the night before and was now recovering from it with breakfast. He had the news playing low on the counter television. He poured orange juice into 2 glasses. He brought everything to the table and sat down and talked about the reception the way you talk about a movie you enjoyed, with selective highlights and no particular urgency. He said the new CEO had been sharp. Sharper than he expected, which was the kind of compliment that reveals what the expectation was. He said the room had good energy. He thought his conversation with Greg had opened a useful door for the presentation he had coming up in 3 weeks. He was optimistic. He used that word specifically, optimistic, and he said it with the settled quality of a man who believed his optimism was warranted. He did not mention introducing me as the babysitter. He did not mention Diane walking into that ballroom. He did not mention the moment when the CEO of the company he worked for had looked across the room and found his wife's face with the instant recognition of a 14-year partnership. He poured more orange juice and asked me if I had slept well. I said yes. I ate my eggs. I listened to him talk. I need to be precise about what I was doing in those quiet days after the party because I think it is easy to look at silence and call it passivity, and what I was practicing was not passivity. I had spent years inside this marriage being passive, absorbing, adjusting, making myself fit the shape of the space he had allocated for me. What I was doing now was entirely different. I was paying attention with a clarity I had not brought to this relationship in a long time, maybe ever, and what I was learning by watching him talk about eggs and orange juice and the reception was information I needed. Because the man who does not mention the thing that happened tells you everything about whether he knows that something happened. Marcus did not know. That was the part one needed to sit with carefully. He did not introduce me as the babysitter and then go home and lie awake managing the risk. He introduced me as the babysitter and went home and slept soundly and woke up and made eggs. Which meant the version of me he had built in his mind was so thoroughly diminished that what he had said in that ballroom did not register as a risk at all. You only manage risk when you believe the other party has power. He did not believe I had any. I drove to the office that Monday morning and sat in my chair and looked at the Chicago skyline through the window we had chosen specifically because of how it looked on mornings like this, gray and layered and full of a kind of industrial beauty that I have never gotten tired of. Diane was already there. She is always already there. She had left a coffee on my desk, which was our version of a check-in, and when she came to the doorway and leaned against the frame and looked at me, I could see she had been composing what she wanted to say since Thursday night. I told her to close the door. She sat down in the chair across from my desk and looked at me with the specific patience of someone who is going to let you speak at whatever pace you need because they have decided this conversation matters more than their own timeline. I told her everything. Not in the fragmented way you tell things when you are still processing them, pulling pieces out in whatever order the emotion surfaces. I told it the way I would have presented it in a business meeting, sequentially, with context, with the pattern laid out from the beginning so that each individual incident did not have to carry the full weight of the whole but could be understood as part of a structure. I told her about the dinner party 18 months into the marriage where he answered for me before I could speak. I told her about 4 years of events at Halcyon where I had not existed as a professional person. I told her about the invented daughter, because I had confirmed by then, through a contact of Diane's who knew someone at the firm, that Marcus had been telling colleagues he had a wife who stayed home with a child. I told her about the babysitter. I told her about the way he had turned back to Greg without a pause, without a flicker of anything that looked like discomfort, because it was not uncomfortable for him. It had never been uncomfortable for him. Diane did not say anything for a long moment after I finished. She had her hands folded in her lap and she was looking at me in the way that means she is deciding between several true things and choosing the one that will actually help. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" Not "what are you going to do," not "I told you so," which she had never said but which she might have been entitled to because there had been a dinner 5 years ago where she had said something careful and precise about the way Marcus talked about my work and I had redirected the conversation and she had let me. Not "I am so sorry," which would have been well meant and would have moved the focus to her feelings about the situation instead of my plan for it. Just "what do you need from me?" I told her I needed a week to think clearly before I did anything. I told her I needed our legal team's full read on the prenuptial structure and what the current asset picture looked like. And I told her that in the meantime I needed her to do nothing unusual at Halcyon, nothing that would signal a change, because I was not ready to let Marcus know that the ground he was standing on was different from what he thought. She nodded. She picked up her coffee. She said, "You know I have been waiting for you to come back to yourself for about 3 years." I looked at her. She said it without accusation. Just as a fact, the way she states most facts, cleanly and without decoration. I said, "I know. I am back now." She said, "I can see that." We spent the next 45 minutes going through the week's actual work, because the firm did not pause for personal reckonings and we both understood that, and it was honestly a relief to do something functional with my hands and my brain while the larger thing settled in the background. By the time she left my office I had a clearer head and a short list of calls to make. The first was to Claudia. Claudia Reyes had been my attorney since the company's 2nd year. She was the kind of lawyer who understood that her job was not to tell you what you wanted to hear but to tell you what you needed to know and then help you decide what to do with it. She was precise and fast and had a memory that I had tested enough times to trust completely. I called her that Monday afternoon and asked for a meeting. We met on Wednesday morning in her office on Michigan Avenue. She had pulled the prenuptial agreement and had it on the table when I arrived, along with a current summary of the marital asset picture that her team had prepared. She handed me a coffee and sat down across from me and said, "Talk to me." I talked. She listened and made occasional notes in the margin of her legal pad with the focused efficiency of someone who is building a structure in her mind as you speak. When I finished she sat back and looked at the prenuptial agreement for a moment before she said anything. The prenuptial structure was solid. I had insisted on it before the wedding, not out of distrust but out of the same instinct I brought to every structural arrangement in my life, which was to make the foundation clear before you start building on it. The agreement was straightforward in its protections. Assets brought into the marriage remained fully separate. Business ownership and equity were explicitly carved out and protected. What was subject to division was what we had built together during the marriage, which was the joint household account, its balance, and any jointly acquired property. The condo was in my name. I had purchased it 2 years before we married, and the prenuptial agreement confirmed it as a separate premarital asset. The joint account had a balance that was meaningful but not complex. What Claudia walked me through next was the piece I had not fully mapped in my own head, which was the loan. She placed a document on the table and let me read it before she said anything. It was a summary of a personal loan application that Marcus had submitted 8 months earlier to a private lending institution. The application listed projected assets that Marcus expected to have access to within the next 18 months. Among those projected assets was what he had described as his share of the anticipated proceeds from the sale of a jointly owned condo valued at a specific number that was both higher than the current market value and, more critically, based on the assumption that the condo was jointly owned. It was not jointly owned. He knew that. He had signed the prenuptial agreement that said so. I read the document twice. Then I set it down on the table and looked at Claudia. She said, "He used a property he does not own and cannot legally claim as an anticipated asset to secure a loan he has already drawn down partially." I asked what he had done with the funds. She said that based on what her team had been able to review, a portion had gone into a small private investment with 2 colleagues, a venture in the food and beverage space that they had structured as an LLC. The remaining portion had been used for personal expenses over the preceding 8 months. I sat with that for a moment. I want to be accurate about what I felt when I read those documents, because anger would be the obvious answer, and anger was present, but it was not the largest thing in the room. What I felt mostly was a specific kind of grief, not dramatic grief, not the grief of sudden shock, but the quiet grief of having a suspicion confirmed that you had been carrying around for long enough that the confirmation is almost a relief. He had not just erased me publicly. He had also been quietly borrowing against a future he expected me to fund without telling me it was happening. Both things lived in the same person, and both things had the same root, which was that he had stopped seeing me as someone whose knowledge and consent were required. Claudia looked at me across the table and said, "Natalie, you have been very patient with this situation. I want to make sure that what we build now is not just a response to what has happened. I want it to be a structure that protects you going forward." That sentence did something specific to me. Because she was right. I had spent 7 years in this marriage responding. Adjusting when he minimized me, reframing when he edited me out, accommodating when he borrowed against a future he had not discussed with me. I was extraordinary at responding. I had optimized the response so thoroughly that it had started to feel like a character trait instead of a coping mechanism. I was done responding. I told her to prepare everything we needed for independent legal proceedings. I told her I wanted a full asset picture on both sides before any conversation happened with Marcus. I told her I wanted to understand exactly what the loan situation meant legally before I decided how to approach it. And I told her that I needed her to be ready to move quickly when I was ready to move. She said, "I will be." I drove home that afternoon through the kind of November Chicago afternoon that is gray and cold and smells like the lake, and I felt, underneath the sadness and the clarity and the particular fatigue of having finally named a thing you have been circling for years, something that I can only describe as the specific relief of a decision made. Not a decision about what was going to happen next. A decision about who I was going to be while it happened. I was going to be Natalie Voss. Not the woman who looks after things at home. Not the babysitter. Not the quiet adjunct to someone else's professional narrative. I was going to be exactly and entirely myself, and I was going to let the consequences of that fall where they fell. Marcus was on the phone when I got home. He was pacing in the kitchen the way he paced when he was in a good work conversation, energized, leaning into whatever was being said. He covered the phone when I came in and pointed to the refrigerator to indicate dinner was in there, and then he turned back to his call and I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in my coat for a few minutes before I took it off. I looked at the room. Our room. The furniture we had chosen together at a store in the West Loop on a Saturday afternoon 5 years ago, Marcus pushing the cart and making jokes about the absurdity of choosing a lamp with the same seriousness you might bring to a business decision, me laughing more than I expected to, both of us young enough in the marriage that we still found the ordinary business of building a life together funny and light. I thought about that afternoon. I thought about what I had brought into this room and what had been asked to leave it quietly over the years without ceremony. I took off my coat. I changed out of my work clothes. I went downstairs and took the dinner out of the refrigerator, leftovers from Sunday, and ate it at the counter while Marcus finished his call in the other room. He came in when he was done and told me it had been a great call, a potential new client connection through someone he had met at the Halcyon reception. He was pleased. He told me the presentation was coming together. I told him that was good. He asked how my day was. I said, productive. He nodded and opened the refrigerator and I watched him and thought about Claudia's documents on the table and the loan and the invented daughter and the babysitter, and I thought about my grandmother's note card, and I thought about the woman I had been when I walked into this city at 22 with a laptop and a plan and the absolute unsentimentalized conviction that I was going to build something. I was still that woman. She had not gone anywhere. She had just been standing quietly in the corner of a room that had been arranged around someone else, waiting for the moment when it was finally time to take up her actual space. That moment was now. I called Diane that evening after Marcus went to bed. I stood in the kitchen with the lights low and my voice quiet and I told her I was ready. She did not ask ready for what. She knew. She said, okay. Tell me what you need and when. I told her that I needed 1 more week of normal. 1 more week of the surface looking exactly as Marcus expected it to look, because there were things I needed to understand and confirm before anything shifted. I told her that when the week was done I would come to the office and we would sit down with the full picture and begin building what came next. She said, I will have everything ready. What happened in that week was not dramatic from the outside. From the outside it looked like a marriage continuing its ordinary rhythms, breakfast and evening conversations and the low background noise of 2 people living in shared space. What was happening underneath was the process of mapping a territory I had been living in for 7 years as if I were a guest in it. I went through our financial records with the kind of attention I brought to a client property assessment, looking not for drama but for structure, for where the weight was actually distributed, for what was load-bearing and what was decorative. What I found confirmed what Claudia had already outlined. The financial architecture of this marriage had been built primarily by me and attributed largely to us in Marcus's mind, which is a generous interpretation, or attributed largely to him, which is the less generous one. The household account that covered our shared expenses had been funded in a ratio of roughly 70-30 for the past 3 years, with my contributions making up the larger portion. This was not an agreement we had made explicitly. It had evolved, the way financial arrangements in marriages often evolve, through small adjustments that each individually seem reasonable and that collectively become a structure neither person formally agreed to. I also, during that week, confirmed through a separate conversation with a HR contact of Diane's, not someone at Halcyon but someone who moved in overlapping professional circles, that the story Marcus had been telling colleagues about his home life went further than I had understood at the party. He had not simply failed to describe me accurately. He had constructed an alternative. A wife who managed the home. A child, a daughter aged somewhere around 4 in the various tellings. A life that was tidy and contained and domestic in the specific way that makes a man look stable and settled without requiring him to share credit for any of the stability. There was no daughter. There had never been a daughter. We had discussed children twice in 7 years and the conversations had been mutual and inconclusive, the way those conversations often are when 2 people are each waiting for the other to want it more clearly first. But he had manufactured a daughter for the benefit of colleagues who had never met me and would never have reason to question it, and he had maintained that fiction across 4 years of professional relationships. I sat with that particular piece of information for a long time. I am still not entirely sure what it cost me to know it, because the loan was a legal issue and the public humiliation was a relational issue, but the invented daughter was something else, something that sat in a category of its own. It was the evidence that the life he had built and his professional identity was not just one that excluded me but one that had replaced me with a safer, smaller fiction. Not a real person. A prop. A domestic element that completed the picture he wanted to project without requiring anything of him in return. I understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that I had not been in a marriage that was failing. I had been in a marriage that had been quietly running on a parallel track to the life Marcus was actually invested in, and I had funded the parallel track without realizing it was not the main line. On the 8th day after the party, I drove to the office before Marcus was awake. I arrived at 6:45 when the building was almost empty and the city outside was still doing that pre-dawn thing where it is neither dark nor light and the streets have a temporary quiet that feels borrowed. I made coffee in the small kitchen down the hall from my office and I stood at the window and looked at the river and I gave myself exactly 10 minutes to feel everything, the grief and the anger and the strange relief and the sadness for the version of the marriage I had believed in and the clarity that had replaced it. 10 minutes. Then I sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop. And I began to build. Not a response. Not a reaction. A structure. The kind of structure my grandmother would have recognized, the kind built not for the front of a room but for the part of the room that actually holds weight. I wrote down what I knew, what I had confirmed, what I needed, and what I intended. I wrote it in the plain language I use when I am doing my most important work, no softening, no qualification, just the clean architecture of a situation clearly understood. When Diane arrived at 7:30, I had 3 pages of notes and a numbered list that would have made her proud. She came into my office, looked at what was on my desk, and said, "There she is." I looked up. She said, "I have been waiting for that face for a long time." I told her to sit down. I told her we had work to do. And for the first time in 7 years, I felt the complete and uncomplicated alignment of who I was and what I was doing, the feeling of operating at full capacity with no part of myself edited out or set aside for someone else's comfort. My grandmother used to say that the most powerful thing in any room is a woman who has decided. I had decided. The first thing I did was nothing. I want you to understand that as a strategy, not a surrender, because the difference between those two things is everything and most people cannot tell them apart from the outside. Doing nothing when someone expects you to either collapse or explode is one of the most disorienting things you can give them. Marcus came to breakfast that Thursday morning and I was already at the table with coffee and my laptop open, and I looked up when he came in and smiled and asked if he wanted toast. He said yes. I made the toast. We talked about the weather, which was turning genuinely cold now, the kind of Chicago November that stops being atmospheric and starts being a personal inconvenience. He left for work at 8:15. I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment and then I picked up my phone and began making calls. The first call was to Thomas Wren, our firm's financial strategist, who had been with Voschen for 6 years and whose entire professional identity was organized around knowing exactly where every dollar was and what it was doing at any given moment. I asked him to prepare a complete current valuation of my ownership stake in the firm, the holding company interests, and any personal assets that had originated before or during the marriage. I told him I needed it clean, documented, and ready to present to legal counsel. He did not ask why. Thomas never asks why. He asks when, and the when was as soon as possible. The second call was to a woman named Patricia Osei, who was a forensic accountant that Claudia had recommended and who I had never needed before but had kept the number of, in the way that you keep certain numbers in your phone as an acknowledgement that the world is more complicated than your best days. Patricia had a voice like a person who has reviewed enough financial documents to find human dishonesty more tedious than shocking, and she took the details I gave her with a composed efficiency that I found immediately reassuring. She said she could have a preliminary picture for me within 5 business days. I said that was fine. The third call was to Diane, who was in the car on her way to a client site and answered on the second ring the way she always does when she knows I am executing something. I told her the presentation was in 3 weeks. She said she knew. I told her I thought it was time for her to schedule a background briefing with the Halcyon executive team about our firm's ongoing relationship with their client network. A standard alignment meeting, the kind that a new CEO would reasonably expect from a major consulting partner. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would read as anything other than professional due diligence. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she did not understand what I was saying, but because she was tracing the full shape of it, following the line from where it started to where it would land. Then she said, "You want them to know who they are working with before he walks into that room." I said, "I want the room to be accurate before he fills it with something that isn't." She said, "Done." I want to tell you what happened with Marcus's presentation carefully, because the most important thing about it is what I did not do. I did not call Halcyon. I did not contact the hotel brand Marcus was pitching. I did not orchestrate an outcome or position any piece on any board. What I did was exist, fully and accurately, as myself, in a professional landscape that I had helped build over 14 years, and I allowed that existence to be known to the people who needed to know it before Marcus walked into a room and described a version of reality that was missing its most significant fact. The hotel brand Marcus was courting was called Meridian Collection. They operated 8 mid-market boutique properties across the Midwest and had been in quiet conversations with Halcyon about a potential partnership structure for about 4 months. What Marcus knew about Meridian was what he had researched himself: their public profile, their expansion goals, their market positioning. What he did not know was that Boss Chen had completed 2 operational restructuring projects for Meridian properties in the past 3 years. We had redesigned their housekeeping efficiency model at their Indianapolis location and their front-of-house guest experience framework at their property in Milwaukee. Both projects had been well-documented successes. Both had generated referrals. Meridian's VP of Operations, a woman named Carol, sent Diane a holiday card every December. The background briefing Diane scheduled with Halcyon's executive team happened on a Tuesday, 9 days after the party. It was a standard 1-hour session, conducted at Halcyon's offices, attended by Diane, one of our senior partners, and 2 members of Halcyon's new leadership team under their CEO. The agenda was exactly what it appeared to be: an overview of the consulting relationship, current and historical client overlaps, and the ways the 2 organizations could work more effectively together going forward. Diane told me afterward that she had presented our firm's profile with the same clarity she brought to every professional introduction, including our founding story, our ownership structure, our client list, and the full names of our principals. She said she mentioned my name 4 times in the course of that hour, each time in a context that made my role and my identity completely unambiguous. She said the response from the Halcyon leadership team was warm and engaged and included at least 2 moments where someone on their side said something along the lines of, "We had no idea the connection went back that far." She said nobody in the room appeared to know that the co-founder of Voschen was also the wife of their senior accounts director Marcus Carver. She said the CEO had said she was looking forward to working more closely with our firm. She said all of this to me over the phone on Tuesday evening while I was in the kitchen making dinner and Marcus was in the living room watching the news, and I listened to every word and then I said, "Good," and then I asked her what she wanted for lunch tomorrow because we had a working session scheduled and I was planning to order from the Italian place on the corner. She laughed, which is the sound of someone who has known you long enough to understand that your composure is not the absence of feeling but the presence of direction. Marcus's presentation to Halcyon happened on a Thursday morning. He left the house at 7:30 in the suit he had pressed the night before, with his talking points reviewed and his handshake ready and the particular focused energy of a man who believes this is his moment. I watched him go from the kitchen window the way you watch something whose trajectory you already know without being the one who set it in motion. I found out what happened in that conference room not from Marcus but from Priya. Priya Anand was one of the women from the Halcyon marketing team I had spoken to at the reception, the one who had found me interesting in the corner of the room and made actual conversation with me while my husband had his back turned. She had reached out to me the week after the party through our firm's website, which I only learned about when my assistant flagged the inquiry. She had found Voschin through a search, she said, because our conversation had stayed with her and she had wanted to know more about the work. We had a call scheduled for that Thursday afternoon, which I had not yet connected to Marcus's presentation timeline because I had not known she was at Halcyon in a capacity that put her in the orbit of that conference room. When she called me that Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, she started the conversation normally, introducing herself more formally than we had spoken at the party, explaining her role in Halcyon's marketing division. And then, after about 3 minutes of professional context, she paused and said, "I have to ask you something directly." I said, "Please." She said, "Was your husband aware that Meridian Collection was a Voschin client when you pitched them this morning?" I was quiet for a moment. Not because I was surprised but because I wanted to answer accurately. I said, "No. He was not aware." She said, "That explains a great deal about how the room went." She described it to me the way a person describes something they witnessed from close range and are still processing. Marcus had walked in confident, well-prepared, with a pitch that was genuinely competent. He had the data and the relationship history and a clear value proposition for why Halcyon was the right partner for Meridian's expansion. He had been maybe 10 minutes into his presentation when one of the Meridian representatives had mentioned, in the collaborative and conversational tone of someone who assumes the information is shared, that they had of course been working with Voschin for several years and were curious how the Halcyon partnership would interface with that existing relationship. Marcus had not known what to do with that sentence. Priya said the pause was only about 4 seconds but that in the context of a conference room it was long enough to be noticed. She said Marcus had recovered and said something professionally neutral about collaboration and alignment, but that the room had shifted in the small but distinct way that rooms shift when someone has revealed, without meaning to, that they do not have the full map. After the meeting, she said, Marcus had asked someone quietly in the hallway who at Voschin he should be coordinating with. They had told him the co-founder's name. He had not said anything in response. I sat with my phone against my ear and looked at the wall of my office and thought about that hallway and that silence and what it must have felt like for him to hear my name in that context for the first time, not as his wife, not as the woman who looked after things at home, but as the person whose professional footprint was already in the room before he arrived. Priya said, "I have a question for you that is separate from all of that." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "I would like to explore whether there is a project within Halcyon's marketing restructuring where Voschin could be useful. I looked up your firm's work after the party because you seemed like someone who knew exactly where she was standing even when the room was not acknowledging it, and I have learned to pay attention to that." I told her I appreciated that and that I would send her our current capabilities document and we could schedule a proper exploratory meeting. She became a client 4 months later. She also became, over time, someone I consider a friend, which is the category of outcome I have learned not to plan for but to recognize when it arrives. Marcus came home that Thursday evening and I knew from the way he moved through the front door that the day had not gone as he expected. He did not have the loosened, satisfied quality of a man returning from a successful meeting. He had the careful stillness of someone who has been holding something for several hours and has not yet decided how to set it down. He said hello. He went upstairs and changed. He came back down and asked what was for dinner. I said I had made chicken and rice, his mother's recipe, which I had learned early in our marriage and made better than she did, a fact that neither of us had ever said aloud. He ate dinner without the topic arising. We talked about a television series we had been watching, a safe topic, a topic with no edges. After dinner he poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter and I could see him deciding whether to say something. He said, "Did you know that Meridian Collection was connected to your firm?" I looked at him. I said, "Yes. I have known for 3 years." He said, "And you did not think to mention it?" I put down the dish I was holding. I turned to face him fully. I said, "Marcus, in 4 years of working at Halcyon you have never once asked me whether my firm had any connection to your professional world. You have never asked about my client list. You have never asked about our partnerships. You told your colleagues I was the babysitter." The last sentence landed differently from the others. I had not planned to say it that specific evening. It came out with the precision of something that has been waiting for the right container. He went very still. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I said what was true in the same register I would have used to discuss anything factual, and I let it sit in the kitchen between the two of us like a third person who had been present for a long time and was finally taking up the appropriate amount of space. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried again and said, "That was not what I meant it to sound like." I said, "What did you mean it to sound like?" He did not have an answer for that. Not because he was inarticulate but because there was no answer that was also honest. I said, "I think we should both have our own legal counsel going forward." He looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had not seen on his face before, not in 11 years. It was not anger. It was not guilt in the performed sense. It was closer to the look of a man who has walked into a room he believed he understood and has just discovered that the floor plan is entirely different from what he was given. He said, "Natalie." I said, "I am going to take Pepper for a walk." I clipped the leash to Pepper's collar and walked out into the November cold, and I walked 3 blocks before I let myself breathe fully. The street was quiet and the cold was clean, and Pepper moved beside me with the focused contentment of a dog who has no sense of the human architecture surrounding her and is simply glad to be outside, which was honestly something I envied her at that particular moment. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because sometimes people expect a certain kind of release at these turning points, and I did not have it. What I felt walking those 3 blocks was something quieter and more durable than tears. It was the specific solidity of a woman who has finally said the true thing in the room where it needed to be said and is now standing in the aftermath of that truth with both feet on the ground. What happened next with the loan situation unfolded not through anything I did directly but through the legal process that Claudia had set in motion. When she submitted the corrective documentation to the lending institution clarifying the actual ownership status of the condo, the lender's compliance team initiated a review of Marcus's original application. This was standard procedure when material facts in a loan application were shown to be inaccurate. The review did not move quickly, these things rarely do, but it moved, and within 2 weeks Marcus received a letter requesting clarification on several items in his original submission. He did not tell me he received the letter. I knew because Claudia had flagged that the process was underway. I did not tell him I knew. What I did instead was continue to be completely myself in every interaction with the firm, with our clients, with the professional world that Marcus had spent 4 years pretending was separate from his. The investment he had made with his 2 colleagues, the Food and Beverage LLC, was structured around projected returns from assets that were now under review. When the asset picture was revisited in light of the loan clarification, the investment structure became complicated in ways that required the 3 partners to renegotiate their terms. I never spoke to those colleagues. I never contacted their entity. The complication arose naturally from the correction of an inaccuracy, the way these things do when the fiction that held up a structure is removed and the structure has to find a new foundation. Marcus's colleague Greg, the one from the party, the one Marcus had pivoted toward immediately after introducing me as nobody, reached out to Diane through a professional contact asking about Boss Chen's interest in the food and beverage space. He had no idea, when he made that inquiry, that the co-founder of Boss Chen was the same woman he had smiled at politely at a party while her husband described her as the babysitter. Diane handled the inquiry professionally and without comment. She told me about it over lunch the following week and I laughed, which surprised both of us. She said, "I did not know you were going to laugh." I said, "I did not know either. It is just that the smallness of it is almost elegant." She said, "You are going to be okay." I said, "I know. I have been okay for a long time. I just stopped telling myself so." The 4th shift of those weeks was the one I had not planned and could not have engineered, which is usually the kind that matters most. Diane had been asked by Halcyon's leadership team to speak at an internal lunch they were hosting for their senior accounts staff, a leadership development series the new CEO had initiated as part of a broader culture restructuring. Diane was invited as an external voice, someone whose firm had a meaningful relationship with the Halcyon ecosystem and who could offer perspective on building durable professional partnerships. She gave a 15-minute talk. I have heard Diane speak publicly many times over 14 years, and she is always good, precise, and warm and specific in the way that makes an audience trust her immediately. She talked about the early years of building Voss Chen, the dorm room in Ann Arbor, the first client meeting where neither of us looked old enough to be taken seriously, and we both knew that the only thing standing between us and that credibility gap was the quality of what we had prepared. She talked about what we had built and what it had cost and what it had given back. She talked about the partnership at the core of it. She used my name the way she always uses my name, without announcement, without underlining, just as the name of someone who exists and matters and has been present in every room we have ever built together. She said, "Natalie Voss and I started this firm because we believed that the most important work in any organization happens in the places people do not photograph." She built the back-of-house intelligence that made us credible before we were known. Everything we are came from that foundation. She said this to a room of Halcyon senior accounts staff. Marcus was in that room. I was not. I did not need to be. I was in my own office on the 14th floor of our building looking at the river, doing the work I had always done, being the person I had always been, in the room where I had always belonged. And somewhere across the city, in a conference room full of people who had believed for 4 years that Marcus Carver's wife looked after things at home, my name was being said clearly and completely for the first time in all the space it actually occupied. He called me that afternoon. I was in a meeting and did not answer. He called again 20 minutes later. I was still in the meeting. The third call came at 4:30 and I was at my desk and I looked at his name on my screen for a moment and then I sent it to voicemail. He texted instead. The text said, "We need to talk tonight." I texted back, "Okay." He was home before me, which was unusual. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I came in, not with his phone out, not with the television on, just sitting with his hands flat on the table surface in the specific stillness of someone who has been waiting and has used the waiting time to try to arrange themselves into a posture that will be useful for the conversation they need to have. I put my bag down. I poured a glass of water. I sat across from him. He said, "Why did you not tell me?" I said, "Tell you what specifically, Marcus, because there are several things I did not tell you and I want to make sure we are discussing the right one." He looked at me. He said, "About the firm. About what you actually built. About how big it is. About Meridian. About Diane being involved with Halcyon." I said, "I told you about the firm 8 years ago. I told you everything. The name, the clients, the ownership structure, the revenue. I sat across from you at that table and I laid it out completely." He said, "I know you did." I said, "And in 8 years you never asked a single follow-up question. You never retained the name of a single client. You introduced me to your colleagues as the woman who looks after things at home. You told people we had a daughter." That last sentence landed the way I knew it would. His face changed. He said, "How do you know about that?" I said, "Because I am a person who pays attention, Marcus. I have always been a person who pays attention. I just stopped applying it to things that were going to hurt me." He was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Pepper shifted on her bed in the corner. Outside the kitchen window the city was doing what the city does in the evening, producing its reliable ambient sound, the low background noise of several million lives proceeding simultaneously. He said, "I did not know how to be the person in this marriage who had less." I looked at him. He said it quietly, not as an excuse, just as a fact he was finally saying in the room where it had always lived. He said, "When you told me about the firm, I felt something I did not have a name for at the time. I think I understand it better now. I was proud of you and I was also ashamed of myself and I did not know how to hold both of those things at once, so I just put you somewhere smaller in my head where the gap did not feel so large. And then I kept doing it because it had become the shape of things and I did not know how to change the shape without admitting what I had done." I sat with that for a long time. I let it be as true as it was and as insufficient as it was at the same time, because both things were accurate and neither cancelled the other out. I said, I believe you. I believe that is what happened inside you. And I need you to understand that the effect of what happened inside you was that I disappeared inside this marriage, not dramatically, not all at once, but completely. And I cannot rebuild something on a foundation where my size in your mind is determined by your comfort with your own. He nodded. He did not argue. He looked like a man who had finally heard a sentence that he had been avoiding for years and had discovered that hearing it, while hard, was less destructive than the avoiding had been. I stood up. I said, I think you should call your attorney tomorrow. He said, Natalie. I said, I am going to take Pepper for her walk. And I did. I walked out into the evening and I walked further than usual, 6 blocks, 7, past the coffee shop where Marcus and I used to go on Sunday mornings in the early years, past the park where Pepper liked to chase the geese who had long since moved south for the winter, past the corner where I had once stood in a thunderstorm waiting for a cab and thought, I love this city. I love it the way you love something that does not require you to explain yourself to it. I stopped at that corner. I stood there in the November cold with Pepper sitting obediently at my feet and I looked at the street and I breathed. My grandmother had a phrase she used when she was done with something. Not done as in finished but done as in complete, the way a piece of work is complete when it no longer needs anything added to it. She would look at whatever she had been working on, the hemmed skirt, the repaired chair, the lesson plan she had written out by hand even in her retirement years, and she would say, that is what it is now. Standing on that corner I felt that. The marriage was what it was now. Not what I had hoped. Not what I had built my life around. But what it actually was, fully seen, fully understood, with nothing edited out and nothing I was still pretending into a different shape. That is what it is now. I looked down at Pepper. She looked up at me with the complete and uncomplicated trust of an animal who has decided you are her person and finds that sufficient. I said, okay, let's go home. And I meant both things at once. The literal walk back. And the other thing. The going back to myself. The returning to the woman who had been standing in the corner of a room that belonged to her for long enough. The beginning of what came next. I was ready for what came next. The Sunday Marcus asked if we could really talk. I made coffee before he came downstairs. Not because I was performing domesticity or because I wanted the scene to feel softer than it was going to be. I made coffee because I always make coffee on Sunday mornings and I had decided that one of the things I was no longer willing to do was reorganize my ordinary habits around the emotional weather of someone else's pending conversation. The coffee was for me. He could have some if he wanted. That distinction mattered to me in a way that is hard to explain but felt, in the weeks following the party, like one of the most important distinctions I had learned to make. He came downstairs at 8:30. He was wearing the grey Henley again, which I noticed with a kind of detached affection, the way you notice the familiar details of a life you are in the process of understanding differently. He poured himself a mug and sat across from me at the table and folded his hands around the warmth of it and looked at me with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something and is now hoping the rehearsal holds. He said he wanted to have an honest conversation. I said I had been hoping for one of those for some time. He took that without deflection, which was new, and which I noted. He said he had been thinking, since the week of the presentation, since Diane's talk, since the evening I told him to call his attorney, about what had actually happened in this marriage. Not the surface version, not the version where things had simply drifted and nobody was specifically responsible, but the real version, the one underneath the surface where the actual decisions lived. He said he needed to start by telling me something he had not said to anyone. I held my coffee and waited. He said that when I had told him about Boston 8 years ago, the full picture, the ownership structure, the revenue, the client list, he had felt something he had not had the maturity to name at the time. He said it was not simple jealousy, although jealousy was part of it. It was something more specifically located, a kind of vertigo that came from realizing that the woman he had chosen, the woman he had believed he was choosing in part because she made him feel capable and grounded, had built something that made his own professional life look not just smaller but fundamentally different in scale and ambition. He said he had grown up watching his father be the provider, the architect of the family's financial life, the person whose professional identity organized everything else. He said his mother had reinforced that architecture so consistently and so completely that he had absorbed it as the natural shape of things without ever examining whether it was a shape he had chosen or simply inherited. He said when he discovered the actual dimensions of my professional life he had not known what to do with the inheritance. He said he had done the worst possible thing, which was to manage his discomfort by managing my visibility. He said he understood now that every time he introduced me without my professional context, every event at Halcyon where I did not exist as a person with a career and a company and a name that meant something, every time he told colleagues a version of our life that was smaller and tidier and more legible to his own sense of himself, he had been performing a surgery on my identity that he had not asked my consent for and that I had not agreed to. He said he was sorry. I let the word sit in the room. I did not rush to receive it or deflect it. I let it be what it was and I assessed it with the same honesty I was trying to bring to everything in those weeks. Then I said, "I believe you mean that." He looked up. I said, "I also need you to understand something that the apology does not reach. Marcus, an apology addresses what you did. What I am sitting with is what it made of me. Not what you intended, but what actually happened to the woman who spent 7 years absorbing your management of her." I stopped introducing myself fully in rooms because I had grown accustomed to not being introduced at all. I stopped expecting to be seen professionally by the person I came home to every night. I made myself smaller in ways I did not even notice until I measured myself against who I was before you and found that significant portions were missing. He was quiet. I said, "You did not take those things from me with malice. I understand that now. But they are missing, and the work of recovering them is mine to do, and I cannot do that work inside a marriage where the foundation was built on a version of me that was never accurate." He said, "Is there anything I could do? Any version of this where you would consider?" I said, "Marcus, we cannot rebuild a house while we are still standing in the version of it that was not true. And I am not willing to spend another 7 years finding out if the rebuild is possible. I know what I need now. I need to be fully myself in every room I walk into, including the rooms we share. And I know, with a clarity I wish I had brought to this conversation years earlier, that the rooms we have shared have not been built for that." He nodded. It was a small nod, the kind that means a person has heard something they already knew and were hoping to be talked out of. He said, "I think I knew this was where we were going from the night you took Pepper for a walk and did not come back for an hour." I said, "I think you knew before that." He said, "Yes. I think I did." We sat with that for a while. The coffee went slightly cool. Outside the kitchen window the city was doing its Sunday morning thing, quieter than weekdays, a little slower, the particular rhythm of a city that is allowing itself a brief rest. I thought about how many Sunday mornings I had sat in this kitchen and felt the low-grade discomfort of a life that did not quite fit and told myself it was just the ordinary friction of two people sharing space over time. It had not been ordinary friction. It had been the specific discomfort of a woman living inside someone else's edited version of her. I was done living in edited versions of myself. The legal process, once it was formally underway, moved with the clean efficiency that well-prepared processes tend to have. Both attorneys were professional and direct. The prenuptial agreement held exactly as Claudia had said it would. The condo remained mine. The joint account was divided according to the contribution ratio that Thomas had documented, which meant the settlement reflected what had actually been put in rather than an assumed equal split. Marcus retained his investment in the Food and Beverage LLC, which was at that point operating on restructured terms following the loan review, and he retained his personal savings and his professional assets. What he did not retain was the narrative. I do not mean that as a punishment. I mean it as a natural consequence. When you build a professional identity on a fiction and the fiction is corrected, the narrative reorganizes itself around the truth, and the truth was that Marcus Carver's wife had not been the babysitter. She had been the co-founder of the firm whose fingerprints were on 2 of his major client relationships. She had been the person whose professional footprint existed inside the building he walked into every morning in ways he had never thought to map. She had been, in every room he had tried to make her absent from, already present. He did not lose his job. I want to be clear about that because I never wanted that outcome and I would have been troubled by it. What he lost was the particular kind of credibility that comes from being seen as someone who has a complete and accurate picture of his own world. That is a different kind of loss and in some ways a more lasting one, because you can recover from a professional setback with work and time, but the reputation of being the person who did not know what his wife did, who described her to colleagues as nobody while she was quietly embedded in his professional landscape, that particular reputation requires a much longer and more specific kind of rebuilding. He moved into an apartment in Wicker Park in January. I know this because he told me the address in case there were any remaining administrative items to coordinate, which there were, a few, small practical things that required a forwarding address and a brief exchange of documents. He said the apartment had good light and was close to the train. I said that sounded reasonable. We were very civilized about all of it, which is the word people use when two people are managing a painful thing with more grace than they feel, and which I think is actually a form of mutual respect that does not get acknowledged enough. Pepper stayed with me. This was not a negotiated point. Pepper had always been primarily mine in the organic way that animals attach, following me from room to room, waiting at the door, finding her spot against my feet wherever I settled. Marcus agreed without argument. On his way out the door the last time, carrying the final box of his things, he stopped and crouched down and said goodbye to her with the genuine tenderness he had always shown the dog, which is one of the things about him I will keep in the category of true and good. He stood up and looked at me. He said, "I hope you know I am proud of what you built. Even if I never figured out how to say it the right way." I said, "I know. I hope you figure out how to say it the right way to the next person before it costs you the same thing." He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded and picked up his box and walked out the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed. Pepper leaned against my leg. The apartment was very quiet in the particular way it becomes quiet when the person who was part of its daily sound is no longer in it, not empty exactly, just reconfigured. I went to the kitchen and made tea and stood at the window and looked at the street and let myself feel what was true, which was that it was sad and also correct, which is the hardest combination to hold because we are trained to believe that sadness means we have made a mistake and that correct means we should not feel the loss. Both things were true at once and I held both of them and I let the tea go warm in my hands and eventually I said out loud to nobody in particular or maybe to my grandmother, "Okay. What comes next?" What came next was Sandra. I had been expecting her in some form. Sandra Carver was not the kind of woman who allowed significant events involving her son to proceed without her involvement, and the end of her son's marriage was not going to be an exception. She called me 4 days after Marcus moved out, on a Wednesday afternoon when I was between meetings and made the mistake of answering a number I did not immediately recognize. Her voice was composed in the way that very controlled anger composes itself, each word placed precisely, the sentences short enough to maintain the pressure. She said she needed to speak with me about what I had done to Marcus's career. I said, "Hello, Sandra." She said she was not interested in pleasantries. She said that whatever I had orchestrated behind the scenes, whatever professional sabotage I had engaged in through Diane and through Halcyon and through the loan situation, had cost her son his standing at a company where he had worked hard for 4 years and she was not going to pretend she did not know what I had done. I let her finish. It took about 3 minutes. She was thorough. Then I said, "Sandra, I need to correct something before we continue." She said, "I am not finished." I said, "I know. But what you are saying is built on an assumption that is not accurate and I would rather correct it now than let you continue building on a foundation that will not hold." She was quiet, which was its own kind of answer. I said, "I did not contact Halcyon. I did not orchestrate any professional consequence for Marcus. I did not call his colleagues or his clients or anyone connected to his career. What I did was exist as myself, fully and accurately, in the professional landscape I have been building for 14 years. The consequences Marcus experienced at work were the natural result of a gap between the version of his life he had been presenting to colleagues and the reality that was always there underneath it. She said, "You could have told him. You could have given him the information years ago and avoided all of this." I said, "I did tell him. I told him everything 8 years ago. He chose not to retain it. He chose not to ask questions. He chose to tell his colleagues his wife stayed home with a child we do not have. Those were his choices, Sandra, and they had consequences, and the consequences are not something I engineered. They are something he built into the foundation by deciding that the truth about who I was would be inconvenient for the story he wanted to tell." She said, "That is a very clean version." I said, "It is the accurate version. Clean and accurate are not always different things." She was quiet again. Longer this time. Then she said something I had not expected. She said, "I told him when he was a child that a man should be the strongest thing in his marriage. I told him that was what a family needed. I told him that enough times that he believed it. I did not say anything." She said, "I did not think about what it would cost him if he married someone stronger." I sat with that for a long moment. Because it was honest in a way I had not expected from her, and because it named something real about the inheritance Marcus had been working from, the blueprint he had been handed before he was old enough to question its dimensions. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said, "I am still angry with you." I said, "I understand. You can be angry with me and also accurate at the same time. Both of those things are available to you simultaneously." She hung up. Not with a slam, just the decisive click of someone who has said what she came to say and does not need a formal closing. I sat with my phone in my hand for a moment. Then I put it face down on my desk and looked at the river through the window and thought about the specific weight of inherited blueprints and what it costs people to build lives from plans that were not drawn for who they actually are. I thought about Marcus as a boy being told what a man should be. I thought about the distance between that instruction and the reality of a life that had not arranged itself the way the instruction promised. I thought about what it would cost a person to carry that distance for 30 years and to try to close it by flattening the person beside you instead of expanding yourself. I felt something shift in me that I can only describe as the loosening of a held breath. Not forgiveness in the performed sense. Not the declaration of absolution that people sometimes confuse with genuine release. Something quieter and more personal. The understanding that what had happened in my marriage was not only about me and Marcus but about something much older that both of us had been navigating without a full map. That understanding did not change what had happened. It did not return the 7 years or the identity I had spent those years quietly losing. But it gave the story a human shape instead of a villain shape, and that mattered to me because I am not a person who is well served by simple stories. I have never trusted them. Simple stories cut out the weight-bearing parts and then wonder why the structure falls. The week after Sandra's call, I did something I had not done in years. I drove back to Columbus. Not for any specific practical reason. There was no estate business, no family obligation on a fixed date. I drove back because I needed to stand in the city where I had started, to walk past my grandmother's house on the street where the windows rattled in winter, to sit in the quiet of a place that knew me before I was anyone's wife or anyone's professional identity or anyone's edited version of themselves. The house had different owners now. Had for years. But the street was the same and the distance between houses was the same and the angle of the light through the trees in November was the same, that specific sideways winter light that I had grown up in and had never found exactly replicated anywhere else. I parked and I walked. I walked past the house where I grew up and past the house where my grandmother had lived and past the school where my mother had worked and past the corner store where I used to buy a specific candy bar on Friday afternoons as a reward for a completed week of something, homework or a hard practice or just the general labor of being a child who took things seriously. I sat on a bench in a small park near the end of the street. It was cold. I had my coat and my scarf and a cup of coffee from a drive-thru that was not very good, and I sat there and looked at the neighborhood and I talked to my grandmother. I do this sometimes. Not in a mystical way, not in a way that requires a particular belief about what continues after a person is gone. I do it in the practical way of someone who learned most of what she knows from a specific person and still has conversations with that learning when it is useful. I told her what had happened. The marriage, the party, the babysitter, the eggs the next morning, the condo, and the loan and the legal process and the Sunday conversation with the coffee going cool. I told her about Sandra's call and what Sandra had said at the end that had surprised me. I told her about standing at the window looking at the river the morning after Marcus moved out. I told her I was okay. I told her I was more okay than I had expected to be, which either meant I was handling it well or that I had been sadder inside the marriage than I had let myself know, and that both possibilities were worth sitting with. I told her I was building something again. Not a response to what had happened but something forward-facing and intentional, the way she had taught me to build, from the inside out, from the back of the room toward the front, with the most important work in the places people do not photograph. The wind picked up. The coffee went cold. I sat there for another few minutes and then I drove back to Chicago. On the drive back I thought about what comes next, not abstractly, but concretely, the way I have always thought about the future, as a set of decisions that can be made with intention if you are willing to look at where you actually are instead of where you thought you were going. I was 47 days post-party. I was legally separated from a man I had loved and whom I understood now in ways I had not when I loved him most. I was the co-founder and majority owner of a firm that was growing with a momentum that felt, in the best possible way, like something that had been building pressure behind a door and was now moving freely in the open. I had a dog who leaned against my leg and a best friend who left coffee on my desk and a grandmother's note card in my top drawer with the tape marks still visible at the corners. I realized on the highway back to Chicago with the radio low and the winter landscape moving past the windows, everything that actually mattered. Not in the sentimental sense of counting blessings. In the structural sense of a woman who has assessed her assets honestly and found that the load-bearing ones are all intact. What I had lost was the edited version of myself. The smaller version. The babysitter version. The woman who looked after things at home. I had not lost Natalie Voss. She had been there the entire time, standing in the corner of rooms that belonged to her, waiting with the particular patience of someone who knows that the ground always eventually corrects itself toward what is actually true. I had never needed to be rescued. I had needed to remember that I was capable of walking out of the corner and into the center of the room under my own power. I was walking. I pulled into the parking garage of our building, which was my building, which had always been my building, and I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Diane. She answered on the first ring. She said, "How was Columbus?" I said, "Exactly what I needed." She said, "Good. Because I have something to tell you and I want you to be in the right place when I tell it." I said, "I am in the right place." She said, "Meridian Collection called this morning. They want to explore a formal expanded partnership with Voschen across their full property portfolio. All 8 locations. Multi-year engagement. They said they have been wanting to make this call for 2 years but were waiting until they felt the timing was right." I was quiet for a moment. She said, "Natalie." I said, "Yes." She said, "They asked specifically for you to lead the engagement." I sat in the parking garage and looked at the concrete pillar in front of me and thought about a dorm room in Ann Arbor and a whiteboard borrowed from an engineer father and a hotel housekeeper who sat on a porch in Columbus and hemmed skirts and told me without drama that the people who keep things standing are the ones doing the quiet work nobody photographs. I thought about a party at the Fairmont in October. A burgundy dress. A glass of sparkling water set down on a bar with a small, deliberate sound. I thought about the babysitter. Then I thought about Natalie Voss. I said, "Tell them yes." The Meridian engagement began on a Monday in February. I want to tell you about that Monday specifically because it was not a dramatic morning. Nobody was watching. Nobody marked it as significant except me and Diane and Thomas, who had prepared the project brief over the preceding 2 weeks with his usual meticulous efficiency. I drove to the office in the early dark of a Chicago winter morning, parked in my usual spot, rode the elevator to the 14th floor, and walked into a building that had my name on the founding documents and my grandmother's philosophy in its operating model and 14 years of work in its walls. I made coffee. I sat at my desk. I opened the Meridian project file. And I felt, with a completeness that I had not experienced in longer than I wanted to calculate, entirely like myself. Not a recovered version of myself. Not a rebuilt or restored or healing version. Just myself, the way you are yourself when nothing is asking you to be a smaller or simpler or more manageable edition of what you actually are. The feeling was so clean and so total that I sat with it for a few minutes before I did anything else, the way you sit with a view you have waited a long time to see clearly. The Meridian engagement was the largest single-firm contract in Boss Chen's history. 8 properties across 5 Midwest states, a multi-year operational restructuring program that would touch every department from housekeeping to guest relations to revenue management. Carol, Meridian's VP of Operations, flew in from their headquarters in Minneapolis for the kickoff meeting and sat across from me in our conference room and said, "We have been wanting to do this properly for 2 years. We are glad you are finally leading it." I said, "So am I." What I did not say, because it was not Carol's story to receive, was that 2 years ago I would not have been leading it. 2 years ago I would have been in the room in a supporting capacity, present but subordinate, managing my own visibility the way I had learned to manage it inside a marriage that had taught me to take up less space. 2 years ago I was still the woman who looked after things at home, not because that was true but because I had lived inside that fiction long enough for it to start shaping how I moved through rooms even when Marcus was not in them. The thing about being made small is that it does not stay where it was put. It travels. It follows you into rooms where the person who made you small is nowhere present and sits at the table beside you like an uninvited advisor, suggesting you qualify your statements, suggesting you defer, suggesting that the correct amount of space for you is slightly less than what you actually need. I had carried that advisor into rooms for years without identifying it by name. Now that I had named it, I could see the chair it had been sitting in and I could choose not to set a place for it. I led that meeting with the full weight of everything I knew. 14 years of work, every restructured property, every operational model, every lesson from every client who had trusted us with the bones of their business. I was precise and I was confident, and when I was uncertain about something I said so directly and proposed a method for resolving the uncertainty, which is what genuine competence looks like as opposed to its performance. Carol left that meeting with a project framework and a timeline and a clear sense of who she was working with. She sent Diane a text that evening that said simply, "She is exactly what we needed." Diane forwarded it to me with no comment, which was her version of a standing ovation. The months that followed were among the most productive of my professional life, and I say that as someone who has had years I am genuinely proud of. The Meridian work was the kind of engagement that requires you to be fully present at all times, intellectually and operationally, and I gave it everything, not in the depleting way of someone who is pouring from a place of deficit but in the generative way of someone who is working from the full depth of what they have accumulated and finding that the depth is considerable. Simone joined us in March. Simone Okafor had been running a boutique consulting practice in New York for 6 years and had heard about Boss Chen through a referral network that ultimately traced back, in its winding way, to Priya, who had by then become both a client and a connector of the particular kind that good networks produce when the quality of the work is doing its own advertising. Simone flew in for an interview that turned into a 3-hour conversation about operational philosophy, and at the end of it she looked across the table at me and said, "I have been waiting to find a firm that thinks the way I think." I did not expect to find it in Chicago. I told her Chicago was full of surprises. She laughed and accepted our offer the following week and was at her desk the Monday after that, which is the kind of decisiveness I recognized and respected immediately. She brought 3 clients with her from New York. 2 of them became anchor relationships within the first quarter. The third led to a referral that took us into a market segment we had been looking at for 2 years without finding the right entry point. The firm grew in those months not in the explosive way that makes good press but in the structural way that makes durable businesses, organically, from the quality of the work, one relationship at a time. Priya's project with Halcyon's marketing division wrapped up in the spring, and she referred us to 2 colleagues at other firms before the final report was even delivered. She came to the office one afternoon to do the formal closeout meeting, and afterward we walked to the coffee place on the corner and sat in the window, and she said, "Can I ask you something personal?" I said yes. She said, "What was it like? Being in that room at the party and knowing what you knew and just standing there?" I thought about it honestly before answering. I said, "It was the moment I finally understood the full shape of something I had been living inside for a long time. And once you can see the full shape of something, you cannot unsee it." So in some ways the most painful moment was also the most clarifying one I had experienced in years. She said, "Did you know then what you were going to do?" I said, "Not precisely. I knew I was done doing what I had been doing. That was enough of a starting point." She nodded and looked out the window at the street and said, "I think about that a lot. The moment when the thing you have been telling yourself does not hold anymore." I said, "What are you telling yourself that is not holding?" She looked at me. Then she laughed, which was not a deflecting laugh but the kind that happens when someone asks you the exact question you needed to be asked and you are not quite ready for the answer. She said, "I will come back to that." I said, "I will be here." She did come back to it, in pieces, over the following months, and what she built from those pieces was her own story to tell. What I will say is that watching someone else begin the process of deciding to be fully themselves, watching the early courage of that and the specific relief that follows it, was one of the unexpected gifts of the year that came after my marriage ended. You build things when you stop making yourself small. Not just for yourself. You build permission for the people around you who have been waiting for someone to go first. My parents came to Chicago in April. My mother wanted to see the new office, and my father, who had retired from long-haul driving 2 years earlier and was still adjusting to a life organized around a single location, wanted to take Pepper for long walks along the lakefront and have an excuse to eat deep dish pizza, which he considered one of Chicago's greatest contributions to human civilization. They stayed for 4 days. My mother sat in my office on the second morning and looked at the view and looked at the team moving through the open space beyond the glass wall and looked at the Meridian project board with its color-coded timeline and said, "Your grandmother would have liked this room." I said, "I know. I think about her in it often." She said, "She used to say you were going to build something that mattered. She said it when you were 7. She said it like it was a fact she had already verified." I said, "She was usually right about the things she said like that." My mother looked at me for a moment with the particular look of a mother who is reading something in her child's face that she is deciding whether to name. She said, "Are you okay?" "Not in the social way. In the real way." I said, "Yes. In the real way." She said, "And the other thing?" "The marriage." I said, "Sad and correct. Both at once." She said, "I know that combination. It is one of the harder ones." I said, "Yes. But it is honest. And I have decided I would rather have the honest version of my life than the comfortable version of someone else's idea of it." She reached across the desk and put her hand over mine for a moment. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. My mother has always been someone who knows when language is the right tool and when it is not, which is a skill I inherited imperfectly but have been working on for years. My father came back with Pepper at noon, his coat full of lake wind, Pepper's ears still pushed back from the speed of whatever walk they had taken, both of them wearing the satisfied expression of beings who have found their precise correct environment for the morning. He came into the office and looked around and said, "So this is the place." I said, "This is the place." He said, "It looks like you." I said, "That is the best thing you could have said." He said, "I know. I thought about it on the walk." We had lunch, the 4 of us, in the conference room with takeout from the Italian place on the corner, and it was ordinary and warm and full of the specific ease of people who have known each other long enough that the conversation can move in any direction without needing a formal road. My father asked Thomas detailed questions about the firm's financial structure that Thomas answered with visible pleasure because Thomas never gets to talk about financial structure at a lunch that also involves garlic bread. My mother asked Simone about New York and Simone asked my mother about Columbus, and Diane sat at the end of the table and caught my eye at one point with an expression that meant, "This is a good day," and I agreed with my eyes. It was a good day. It was a series of good days, strung together with work and purpose and the specific satisfaction of a life that fit its own dimensions. Daniel arrived at the edges of those good days before he arrived at the center of them. I want to tell you about Daniel carefully because he deserves to be described accurately, not as a reward for surviving the marriage, not as the romantic resolution that ties the story into a conventional shape, but as himself, a specific person who appeared in my life at a specific time and who I chose with the fullness of who I actually was rather than the edited version I had been living inside. Daniel Marsh ran a small architecture firm in the West Loop, 12 people, the kind of practice that takes on projects they believe in rather than every project available, and which has a reputation in the city for work that is structurally rigorous and visually honest, buildings that look like they mean what they are doing. He had grown up in St. Louis, moved to Chicago for graduate school, stayed because the city agreed with him, which was something I understood completely. Simone had known him in New York when they were both in their late 20s and running the early versions of their respective practices in adjacent buildings in the West Village. She had mentioned him to me in late February with the careful offhandedness of someone who has thought about the introduction for longer than they are admitting and is testing whether the mention lands before committing to the setup. I had said, "Tell me about him." She had said, "He asks good questions and he listens to the answers." He is 41 and he was in a long relationship that ended 3 years ago without drama, which in my experience means two people figured out they were not right for each other before it cost them too much. He makes things with his hands, not just architecturally, he builds furniture in a workshop in his building, which I mention because I think it tells you something about a person when they choose to make things slowly and carefully in an age when everything is fast. He is funny without trying to be, which is the only kind of funny I trust. I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay as in you are interested." I said, "Okay as in you can give him my number." She looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this exact moment of permission and is trying not to visibly celebrate. He texted me on a Thursday evening in March with an introduction that was brief and warm and not trying too hard, which is a specific skill that more people should work on. He said Simone had told him good things and that he would like to buy me coffee if I was open to it and that he understood if the timing was not right and there was no pressure either way. He said the no pressure thing in a way that felt true rather than strategic, which was the first thing I noticed. I said I was open to it and we met the following Saturday at a coffee place in the West Loop that was neither my usual place nor his, which I thought was considerate, a neutral ground that belonged to neither of us and therefore required neither of us to be a host. He was already there when I arrived, which I noticed. He stood up when I came in, which I also noticed, not in a formal or performative way, just the natural movement of someone who has been raised to meet a person on their feet. He was tall and had the kind of face that looks better in person than it does in any photograph, which Simone had warned me about and which I was still not fully prepared for. We talked for 3 hours. The coffee went cold, which I was beginning to understand was a sign of a conversation worth having, and we ordered more and that went cold too. He asked about the firm with genuine curiosity, the kind that advances rather than recirculates, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he had actually retained what I said 5 minutes earlier. He asked about what I found most satisfying in the work, and when I told him about the back-of-house philosophy, the invisible infrastructure, the housekeeper's granddaughter angle, he leaned forward slightly the way people do when something resonates with something they have been thinking about. He said, "I think about that in architecture constantly. The parts of a building that nobody photographs but that determine whether the building actually works. The structural elements that make the beautiful elements possible. Most clients want to talk about the facade. I am always trying to talk about what is underneath it." I said, "My grandmother called those the weight-bearing parts." He said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." I said, "She was the most important person in my education." He said, "Tell me about her." And I did. I told him about Eleanor Voss and the porch and the sweet tea and the hemmed skirts and the 41 years at the same hotel and the note card in her schoolteacher handwriting that I had kept in my desk through 3 offices and 2 decades. I told him about the granddaughter at 7 being told she was going to build something that mattered before she had built anything at all. I told him what she said about dignity not being something other people give you and not being something they can take away either. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "I looked you up before today." I said, "I know. Most people do." He said, "I want to be specific about what I mean. I did not look you up to form a first impression. I looked you up because I wanted to know who you were before anyone else decided to tell me. I wanted to come into this conversation with your own words and your own work as the primary source, not someone else's summary of it." I sat with that sentence for a long moment. I said, "That might be the most thoughtful thing anyone has said to me in a long time." He said, "I had a feeling you had earned the right to hear it." We met for dinner the following week. And the week after that for a walk along the lakefront that lasted 2 hours longer than either of us had planned for. And on a Saturday in April he showed me the workshop in his building where he built furniture, a long worktable covered in tools I recognized by category but not by name, a half-finished bookcase against the wall in a wood the color of strong tea, sawdust on the floor in the particular way that means serious work has been happening in this room for a long time. He picked up a piece of the wood and showed me the grain and explained how the way wood grows determines what it becomes under the hand, how you cannot force it into a shape that contradicts its nature, how the best work acknowledges what the material already is and builds from there. I thought about a lot of things while he talked. I did not say all of them. Some things you hold for a while before you share them, not out of withholding but out of the appropriate care for something that is still becoming what it is. What I said was, "That sounds like a philosophy that applies to more than furniture." He said, "I know. I think it applies to most things worth building." We have not made announcements. We have not used words that draw lines around something that is still finding its shape. What we have is a series of specific and accumulating moments, dinners and walks and long conversations that move through subjects the way a good conversation does, not covering them like checkboxes but inhabiting them, staying until something true has been said. He says my name the way it is spelled, fully, Natalie, not a nickname or a shortened version or a diminutive, just the complete name I was given and grew into, and he says it the way you say something you have decided to take seriously. I am taking it seriously too. In the way that is appropriate for something real, which means carefully and without rushing and with the full weight of who I actually am rather than a managed edition of it. On a Tuesday morning in May I arrived at the office before anyone else, which is still my habit and which I do not expect to change. I made coffee and stood at the window and looked at the river in the early light. The water was doing what Chicago water does in May, moving with the specific restless energy of a season that has finally arrived after a long negotiation with the cold. The city was waking up around me in layers, the delivery trucks and the early commuters and the runners along the lakefront path and the particular shift of light from gray to gold that happens in this city on clear May mornings in a way that still, after all these years, makes me understand exactly why I stayed. I opened my desk drawer and took out my grandmother's note card. The paper has aged into a soft ivory. The tape marks at the corners have the specific ghost shape of tape that held something in place for a long time and finally let go. The handwriting is still precise and clear, her schoolteacher hand, the letters formed with the care of someone who believed that how you write something is part of what it says. Dignity is not something other people give you. It is not something they can take away either. You either carry it or you set it down. I had set mine down for a long time. I had set it down in small increments over 7 years until I had set down so much of it that I had stopped noticing its absence, the way you stop noticing the weight of something once your body has adjusted to carrying it differently. I was carrying it now. Fully. Without apology and without the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying someone else's edited version of yourself alongside the original. Just the original. Just Natalie Voss, the housekeeper's granddaughter from Columbus who built something in a dorm room in Ann Arbor and never stopped building. Diane came in at 7:30 with 2 coffees, which was unusual. she almost never brought two, she brought one and let me make the second myself. She set one on my desk and sat down in the chair across from me and looked at me with the expression I have been seeing on her face for over 20 years now, the reading expression, the one that is looking slightly past the surface. She said, "You look different." I said, "I look like myself." She said, "That is what I mean." We sat in comfortable quiet for a moment, the way people do when they have been having the same friendship long enough that the silence is as much a part of it as the conversation. She said, "You know what I have been thinking about lately?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "The first investor meeting. The one where the man in the gray suit talked over both of us for the first 12 minutes and then you waited for him to finish and then you asked him a single question that restructured his entire understanding of what we were proposing and he did not speak over you again." I remembered it. I remembered the conference room and the gray suit and the specific patience of waiting for him to run out of assumptions before presenting him with the accurate information. I said, "I remember." She said, "That is who you have always been. The waiting and then the single question. You have just been practicing it on a larger stage lately." I said, "The stage was always this large. I just stopped standing at the center of it for a while." She lifted her coffee. I lifted mine. We did not make a toast because we are not people who make toasts of the formal variety. We just drank our coffee and looked at the river and the city coming fully alive outside the window. The Meridian project delivered its first quarter results in June. The Indianapolis property had reduced housekeeping operational costs by 18% while measurably improving guest satisfaction scores. The Milwaukee property's guest experience redesign had generated the highest net promoter scores in the brand's 8-year history. Carol sent a message to Diane and me that contained the phrase, "This is exactly what we believed you would do," and then immediately asked when we could begin Phase 2 at the Cincinnati location. We began Phase 2 3 weeks later. Marcus, I heard through the lateral movement of professional information in a city where industries are smaller than they appear, had moved to a smaller firm in the suburbs. He was rebuilding, professionally, in the way that requires starting from a more accurate foundation than the previous one, which is harder in the short term and more durable in the long term if you do it honestly. I wished him that honesty. I wished it to him genuinely, the way you wish something to a person when you have released the outcome and have no stake in the direction it takes except the ordinary human wish that people you once loved find their way to something true. Sandra called me once more, in June, briefly. She said she had been thinking about our last conversation. She said she had been thinking about what she had told Marcus about a man being the strongest thing in a marriage and about what that instruction had cost both of them. She said she was not calling to relitigate anything. She was calling because she thought I should know she had said the same thing to Marcus directly, had told him that the blueprint she had given him was not drawn for the life he had actually been handed, and that she was sorry for the cost of it to both of us. I said I appreciated that. She said, "I hope you are well, Natalie." I said, "I am. I genuinely am." She said, "Good. That was always what I wanted, even if I did not always know how to want it in a way that made room for you." I said, "I know. I believe that now." We did not become close. We did not need to. What we had reached was a kind of honest accounting, two people looking at a situation without the distortions that self-protection produces, and finding that the truth, while not comfortable, was at least workable. Some relationships end in reconciliation. Some end in honest distance. This was the second kind, and the second kind has its own dignity. I put the note card back in the drawer on that May morning. I finished my coffee. I opened the Meridian file and began the day's work. Simone arrived at 8 with a question about the Cincinnati property's staffing model. Thomas arrived at 8:15 with an updated financial projection. Priya called at 9 about a new referral she wanted to introduce us to. Daniel texted at noon to ask if I was free for lunch the following Thursday, that there was a new place in the West Loop he had been curious about and he wanted to know what I thought of the interior because he suspected, based on what he had read about the designers, that I would have opinions about the back-of-house layout. I texted back, "I always have opinions about the back-of-house layout." He sent back, "I know. That is one of my favorite things about you. I set my phone down and smiled at my desk in the way you smile at something when nobody is watching, which is the only kind of smile that tells you the true temperature of a thing. Then I picked up the Meridian file and went back to work. That is where I am now. That is the shape of the life I am building on the other side of the thing that happened in October at the Fairmont Hotel when my husband introduced me as the babysitter and I set my glass down on the bar with a small deliberate sound and decided to stop. I want to say one more thing before I go, and I want to say it directly, because I think it is the thing this story is actually about underneath all the specifics of the marriage and the firm and the party and the legal process. I was not rescued. Not by Diane, not by the prenuptial agreement, not by the loan documents, not by the midpoint twist of a best friend walking into the right room at the right time. All of those things happened and all of them mattered, but none of them were the thing that changed my life. The thing that changed my life was a decision. A single internal decision made while standing at a hotel bar holding a glass of sparkling water in a burgundy dress, surrounded by people who had been told I was nobody. The decision was simply this. I was going to stop agreeing with the smaller version. That is the whole of it. Everything else that followed was the natural consequence of that one decision, lived out with patience and intention and the structural philosophy my grandmother gave me before I was old enough to know how much I would need it. The people who keep things standing are the ones doing the quiet work that nobody photographs. She was right. She was always right about the things she said like that. If you are somewhere right now in a life that is running on an edited version of you, I want you to hear this clearly. The editing is not permanent. The ground that has been organized around someone else's comfort is not the only ground available to you. You can put down the smaller version at any time. You can set it down with the same quiet deliberateness that I set down a glass of sparkling water in October and chose, from that moment forward, to take up the full amount of space that is actually yours. It will not be loud. The best decisions rarely are. It will feel like setting something down and noticing, for the first time in a long time, how much lighter your hands are without it. And if this story found you at the moment you needed it, if something in Natalie Voss's year resonated with something you have been carrying that is not actually yours to carry, I would love for you to stay close to this channel. Hit that subscribe button and come back for the next story, because there is always another woman in another room making the quiet decision to stop agreeing with the smaller version of herself, and I intend to be here every time to tell you about it. My grandmother carried her dignity for 73 years without setting it down once. I am my grandmother's granddaughter. I am just getting started.